with the team gathered, look at the video, and then talk through it with them. If someone else joins an area of ministry and it's March, and they weren't working with kids, now they're working with kids. So not only did they do the New York State, the piece online, that's required, but then they'll watch the video. Their ministry leader will have to sit down with them and take that extra time. So being here in person and getting it all out of the way up front is more efficient for you, for your ministry leader, and ultimately for the work of the church. What we're presenting tonight, most of what's going to come from up here is a broad audience. It's for anyone that works in the nursery. So our birth through 17-year-olds, it's for that whole category. So some of what you hear, you're going to say, I don't see how this applies to Pioneer Girls. Or I don't see how that, because it may not apply, all of it, the specifics may not apply to your specific ministry, but the broad principles and everything we're going to talk about do apply to all the ministries. Of course, because of recent events with one of our staff members last fall, we've hurried this whole thing up. But it's something we really need to do anyway. We'll be doing this at least once a year, maybe this exact format, maybe a little bit different format that's tweaked better to fit our church. In fact, I've had someone this morning, they called me last week and cornered me this morning and said, the group I work with is very interested in what we're doing. Can we borrow some of it, or can we learn from you, because we work with a lot of kids. And whether it's a Christian organization or a non-Christian organization, we live in a world where we just can't take things for granted. We're just not going to do that. Friday night, I talked with the youth kids and the leaders for just a little bit. And one of the things I told them is, I'll just repeat to you as we open up tonight, that we want parents that are starting to come with their kids to know what our policies are. We want you to be able to talk to your neighbors, and when you say, come to our church, pretty soon one of the top questions, in fact for some it's already the top question, but they'll say, how do we protect our kids? And they're not talking about just fire alarms. They're saying, how can we protect our kids? Can we really trust everybody? Are you just taking their word for it? What do you do? And it wasn't too many years ago, in fact this is still true, a number one issue for people who attend a church, if they have nursery age kids, they don't care if they like the people, they like the coffee, they like the music, if they like everything, but they don't think you have a safe, secure, good place for the nursery with good caretakers, they won't come back. And as a grandfather, I wouldn't come back either. And that's still the case. So that's the number one area if you've got kids in nursery. But the same principles are quickly applying to any age kids. So for instance, if I was coming in and I wanted my teenage grandkids to come to a church, I'd be wanting to know if they did things like this. And if they didn't, I'd say, you can't be that trusting. We'll try another church. So this isn't just for us, this is for us, but it's for our church, it's for our community, and I believe, with the elders, we don't want to even just have standards that just make it. Like, well, that's legal. We met the bar for the law. No, we want the bar for the kingdom of Jesus Christ that says we are going to strive for excellence in whatever we do, and this is one of those areas that we're pressing into. So we've got a couple of presenters tonight, very little for me. Jenny Bernstein is going to do the first part, and then Beth Del Judas. I'll do the baton pass, so to speak, in between. Then Beth Del Judas will come up and do the next part, and then we'll do some Q&A. Some of you picked up some handouts in the back. If you didn't, don't worry about it. You don't need them yet. But Jenny's presentation is available. In fact, all of this we're going to end up putting online, the whole presentation anyway, if you want to look stuff up later. But if you're a ministry leader, I do want you to get Jenny's notes. They're in the back. Anyone else is welcome to them, but it's a whole, what? The thick ones? If they're already gone? I only made like 20 because I thought only ministry leaders wanted them. Well, if you're a ministry leader and you didn't get one, I'll get one to you later. You really don't need it because it's all going to be on PowerPoint on the screen here in a minute. Well, let me open up in prayer. Lord Jesus, thank you for gathering us here. Thank you that you love children. You love the children that come to this church. more than we do. So we ask, Lord, in the holy name of Christ, that we will never have an incident in this church that requires any of the stuff we're going through. We pray that the Lord and the holy angels, the holy presence of God, would protect and preserve us from evil and the evil one. And yet we know, Lord, that we need to do our part. We need to be prepared. So I thank you for Jenny and her time and effort tonight. Thank you for Beth and her time and effort tonight. And we pray, Father, that we would be well prepared against the wiles of the evil one and a sick society that we are part of. So minister to us tonight. In the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. Jenny, come on up. Thanks.
Hello all. Many of you know me. For those of you who don't, my name is Jenny Bernstein. I'm a social worker. I work as a therapist, primarily with children, but also with some adults. And I have a lot of experience in having to go through this process as a mandated reporter and dealing with all types of cases where it's necessary to contact the state. So I agreed to come and help out and speak to you guys tonight and kind of help you understand the laws of New York State as it pertains to children's safety and your role as a mandated reporter in working with children. Oops. Sorry. Okay. Starting off, just to give you a kind of scope of the issue that we're working with here in New York State. In New York State, 3 million cases of abuse are reported per year. However, it's estimated that an additional 6 million cases go unreported. And part of that is because 25% of sexual abuse cases that are identified by mandated reporters, they end up not reporting, which is illegal and is obviously contributing to the many cases that are not being intervened. So within the population of children that are being abused, there's a 50-50 split between the victim rate of boys and girls. 75% of cases are due to neglect, 17% are due to physical abuse, and 8% are due to sexual abuse. Within that population, 1 in 10 kids, which turns into 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys, will be sexually exploited before the age of 18. And just to remember, we all remember Statistics 101, that that doesn't mean that 1 in 4 girls in the United States will be abused. It means that 1 in 4 girls within the population, it's a population breakdown. But the rate is still very high of children being exposed to danger. 90% of victims already know their abuser. Only 10% of the perpetrators are strangers or people that the kid does not know. 30% of victims are abused by their parents. 60% are abused by someone the family already knows and trusts. 40% of victims are abused by older children, and 40% of juvenile abusers are under the age of 12. And the peak age for juvenile abusers is 14. Most of them tend to be 14 or under, so when you get to the higher ages of adolescence, the risk lessens. So some common misconceptions. Abuse is not only experiencing direct violence. It encompasses many areas and levels of harm caused by the exploitation and the violation of a child's inherent human rights to safety, security, and self-determination. It's important to understand that abuse isn't just a kid getting beaten. It's a whole spectrum of maltreatment that can cause them emotional, physical, and sexual harm. And between 50 and 60% of children never disclose their abuse, even as adults. Some more misconceptions. Women are just as likely as men to commit child abuse in general, but are less likely to commit specifically sexual abuse. Homosexual individuals are no more likely to commit sexual abuse than heterosexual individuals. And this misconception has been, is very old. Anti-gay propaganda from half a century ago still perpetuates the stereotype. It's something that still has to be fought against because a lot of people still believe that. Some more common misconceptions. Some people believe that neglect is not as big of an issue as physical or sexual abuse. Neglect is just as dire a concern as abuse as it results in more acute emotional and behavioral disturbances and accounts for 40% of maltreatment fatalities, which include both accidents due to neglect and suicides due to emotional maltreatment. And differentiating between two types of child sex offenders. They're not all pedophilic. There are situational offenders who offend during times of stress. They begin offending later in life. They have fewer victims and have a preference for adult partners. However, pedophilic offenders, they start at an earlier age and they have a larger number of victims. Moving into specific New York State laws and definitions. A mandated reporter is one who is required by law to report suspected child abuse and neglect when they are presented with a reasonable cause to suspect that child abuse or neglect is occurring in a situation they are presented with in their professional setting. Reasonable cause is defined that based on your rational observations, professional training, and experience, you have a suspicion that the person legally responsible for a child is responsible for harming or placing that child in imminent danger of harm. And your suspicion can be as simple as distrusting an explanation for an injury. Legal protections for mandated reporters. Mandated reporters have legal immunity if they make a report in good faith, which is presumed. The reporter is immune from civil or criminal liability, which means they cannot be sued for making the report. Confidentiality. Child Protective Services is required to maintain confidentiality about the source of the report. When you make a report, the subject of the report doesn't find out who made it or that you were the one who called. As a mandated reporter, you can request that Child Protective Services notifies you of the outcome of their investigation, but that still doesn't disclose your identity to anybody involved. On the other side, the consequences for failure to report. There's criminal sanction. It is Class A misdemeanor for a mandated reporter to willfully fail to report a cause of suspected child abuse or maltreatment. There's also a civil sanction. A mandated reporter who knowingly and willfully fails to make a report of suspected child abuse or maltreatment is civilly liable for the damages caused by such failure. Now, this is a list from the New York State law, social services law, Title VI, that lists all the different mandated reporters, and it gets vague in certain areas, and people ask, well, in a church as a volunteer, how am I a mandated reporter? The two areas that you fall under would be a school-age child care worker or any other child care worker. It basically tries to encompass anybody who is directly responsible for children in an official setting, like Pioneer Girls, a youth group. They are responsible for reporting anything that they suspect. Okay. Differentiating between the definitions of abuse and maltreatment. Abuse. Physical and sexual abuse fall under the category of abuse, as opposed to the category of maltreatment, which covers everything else from physical to emotional neglect. Abuse encompasses the most serious injuries and or risk of serious injuries to children by their caregivers. That includes, broken bones, serious medical issues, anything all the way up to fatalities. Physical abuse is the non-accidental physical injury of a child inflicted by a parent or caretaker, which ranges from superficial bruises and welts to broken bones, burns, serious internal injuries, and in some cases, death. Sexual abuse is the sexual exploitation of a child by a parent or caretaker or other person, such as fondling, intercourse, or use of a child in the production of pornographic materials. Maltreatment. Physical maltreatment, which includes neglect. The impairment of a child's physical, mental, or emotional condition or imminent danger of impairment by the failure of a caretaker to exercise a minimum degree of care, such as failing to provide food, clothing, shelter, education, failing to provide proper supervision or medical care, inflicting excessive corporal punishment, abandoning the child, or abusing alcohol or drugs. Emotional maltreatment. This is the result of a parent or caretaker's actions or inactions that cause or could cause serious conduct, cognitive, affective, or other mental disorders, including torture or close confinement, constant use of verbally abusive language to harshly criticize or denigrate the child, or emotional neglect, which is withholding physical and emotional contact to the detriment of a child's emotional and, in extreme cases, physical development. There's been a lot of studies showing that infants, particularly in the first couple months of life, if they are deprived of a close bond and the development of an emotional connection to their caretaker, whoever it may be, they are actually, they're limited in their physical development, and they, in some cases, infants who have been deprived of contact entirely have died from that, even if they're given the proper food. It's extremely important for children to develop emotional bonds. There's a diagnosis that's seen in children later in life who are deprived of bonds early on, where it shows that their brains haven't developed the same neural pathways as children who have been provided with the necessary emotional bonds for development, and it results in mental illness later in life. And emotional maltreatment is the most difficult area to prove or collect evidence. Procedures for reporting. Who makes the report? Does everyone here remember the Penn State scandal with Joe Paterno, that whole thing? Everyone remember what happened there? Well, because of what happened there, a change was made to the New York State law. Changes were made to laws in a lot of states, actually. That wasn't exactly advertised because, you know, New York State didn't think anyone needed to know that the law was not covering this. So it was only really advertised in Pennsylvania that this change was made. But prior to 2013, a person with suspicion was required to inform their supervisor, and then their supervisor assumed responsibility for both making the report and submitting the paperwork. And the problem with that was exposed in the Penn State scandal, that the person with the suspicion reported it to their supervisor, and their supervisor reported it to their supervisor, and went all the way up the chain, but it never made it to the state because at the top of the chain they didn't make the report. So what was changed is after 2013, the person with the suspicion is required to both make the report directly as well as inform their supervisor. Their supervisor then assumes responsibility for the paperwork that is done afterwards. But the person who has the suspicion must be the one who directly makes the report. And in most cases, you do that with your supervisor. And I know in the church that would be informing to the designated reporters who will then make the report with you. So it is acceptable, and most of the time is the case that you inform your supervisor and make the call simultaneously. In making the report, preparing the report ahead of time is really beneficial. First, you fill out some paperwork. There's this form from the state called LDSS 2221A. It's only needed, and it's only necessary to submit if the New York State Central Register of Child Abuse accepts the report and investigates it. If they don't, then you don't need to submit it. But since the way the report is put together, the questions that you're going to be asked by the person on the hotline is in the same order, and it's the same questions as the report. So if you fill it out first and have all the information ready, it makes the call much easier and go much more fluidly because you have everything available in front of you. So since you may not need to submit it depending on the outcome, but by having all the pertinent information arranged and in the same order of the questions, you expedite the process. You can also use the form for your own records. So there's no harm in doing it first. So after you have all the information put together, you call the New York State Central Register of Child Abuse and Maltreatment. And there's a separate number for mandated reporters than non-mandated citizens. And it's listed there. So the outcomes of the report, there's 3 outcomes. The first will be that the report is taken. They will tell you that we're going to accept the report and investigate it, and they will give you a case number to write down. And then the person responsible, your supervisor, who is to the designated people in the church, will send in the form to social services. Another outcome is that the report is not taken. They will tell you that they don't think there is sufficient evidence or justification to open an investigation. And then you simply can use the form for your own records. The third outcome is that if the report has information about an immediate threat or crime committed against the child, but the perpetrator is not a person legally responsible for the child, the Central Register will send the report to the New York State Police Information Network, which is the New York State Special Victims Liaison Unit. You're of course also completely free to call the police and make and file a report on your own if you disagree with them not taking the report through the Central Register. You always have that option. These are the 4 most common types of report situations that personally I've come across in my time working in this field. The first, obviously, is an urgent need. That's when a child is being harmed and in danger of being harmed, and there's ongoing abuse or maltreatment. Then you call, and if the report is not taken, then you should continue to pursue the case by asking to speak to the supervisor of the person who is taking your report, or then also contacting law enforcement is another avenue. Another situation where you need to where you would report is being thorough about an old incident. That's when a child discloses something that happened in the past that's no longer going on. They're not in danger of harm, and they're currently safe. You should still be thorough and file a report anyway, because you don't know if a report was filed at that time, and just to have it on record. Most of the time they're not going to take that report. You should still call it in anyway. And if it's not taken, then you don't need to pursue any further action. A third situation would be fulfilling an obligation about a minor situation. An example of that would be if a child reports to you some kind of abuse or maltreatment that's already being handled by a DSS caseworker or another state agency that's already investigating, but you're not sure if anybody already called CPS. Just to cover yourself and to be absolutely thorough, you should make a report and inform them in the report that there is an ongoing investigation from another state department. In that case, they will most likely not take the report, and you don't need to take any further action since there's already an ongoing investigation. The fourth most common type of situation is one that they don't necessarily teach in school, called stacking reports. That's when, particularly in dealing with emotional maltreatment, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, 9 times out of 10, they're not going to accept a report about verbal abuse or emotional abuse, emotional maltreatment, because it's very difficult to investigate and very difficult to prove. And that could be frustrating when you're working with a kid where you know that they're being they're in harm because they're being treated very badly. And a way to get them to take the report is if you make a report, and then the child's school makes the same report, and then the child's doctor makes the same report, and they keep a log of all the calls that come in, and when they see that there's multiple reports being made about the same family in the same situation, then they are more likely to take after multiple calls, they're more likely to take the report and investigate, because numerous sources are reporting the same problem. And I personally had a case that the report was only taken after 4 different agencies made the exact same report within the same month. And finally, there was an intervention that helped. And so coordinating with other agencies is really important in other places that the child goes, like their school. That can really help out in making sure that something gets done. Indicators of abuse. Physical abuse indicators. Special attention should be paid to injuries that are unexplained or inconsistent with the caretaker's explanation and/or the child's developmental stage. These include injuries to the eyes or both sides of the head or body, since accidental injuries typically only affect one side of the body. Frequent injuries of any kind, bruises, cuts, and/or burns, especially if the child is unable to provide an adequate explanation of the cause. If the child suddenly begins exhibiting destructive, aggressive, or disruptive behavior, if the child suddenly begins exhibiting passive, withdrawn, or emotionless behavior, or if the child is exhibiting fear of going home or fear of their parents. Sexual abuse indicators. Symptoms of sexually transmitted diseases, injuries to the genital area, difficulty or pain when sitting or walking, sexually suggestive, inappropriate, or promiscuous behavior or verbalization, particularly age-inappropriate, expressing age-inappropriate knowledge of sexual relations, or sexual victimization of other children. Because most sexual abuse cases do not present apparent physical evidence or indicators, identification and recognition are often very difficult. And the many fears which child victims experience make it extremely difficult for them to report the abuse, even to a trusted adult or friend. Neglect and maltreatment indicators. Obvious malnourishment, listlessness or fatigue, failure to thrive physically or emotionally, stealing or begging for food, lack of personal care, poor personal hygiene, torn or dirty clothes, untreated need for glasses, dental care, or other medical attention, frequent absence from or tardiness to school, or the child is left inappropriately unattended or without supervision. Now, handling disclosure when a child does come and tells you about something concerning. It's very rare that a child will disclose abuse immediately. Abused children often feel a sense of helplessness and think nobody can help them. They may try to protect their abuser, or they fear how their abuser will react. And so children may disclose abuse in many ways. They may blurt it out to you, especially having developed a trusting relationship. They may talk directly in private, or they may make subtler forms or cries for help. Example of subtle outcries would be leaving out a drawing or a letter about it for an adult to find, or frequent trips to the school nurse complaining of vague symptoms with no organic basis. And examples of extreme forms of outcries would be suicidal gestures, threats, or attempts, or self-injurious behaviors such as cutting. Types of disclosure. Children may use indirect hints, saying things like, "My brother won't let me sleep." A child may talk in these terms because he or she hasn't learned more specific vocabulary, because they feel too ashamed or embarrassed to talk more directly, because they have promised not to tell, or for a combination of these reasons. They might also use disguised disclosure by saying something like, "What would happen if a girl told someone that her mother beat her?" Here the child might be talking about a friend or sibling, but is just as likely to be talking about themselves and trying to feel you out for information or see how you might react. Then they use disclosure with strings attached, saying, "I have a problem, but if I tell you, you have to promise not to tell anyone." Most children are very aware of the negative consequences that will result if they break the secret of abuse, Often the offender uses the threat of these consequences to keep the child silent. And it's very important that when they use disclosure with strings attached, that you never promise that you're not going to tell anybody, because the worst thing you could ever do is lie to a kid that is trusting you with their deepest secret. It's a betrayal that they may not come back from very easily. So things that you should do when responding to disclosure: you should find a private place to talk with the child. You should sit next to the child, not across from them or at a table or a desk, because it can be intimidating to be looking at someone and making eye contact when you're talking about a difficult situation. Use language that the child understands, and ask the child to clarify words that you don't understand. Express your belief to the child that you are telling the truth, that they are telling the truth, that you believe them. Reassure them that it is not their fault, that they are not bad and they did not deserve it. Determine the child's immediate need for safety. Let the child know that you will do your best to protect and support them. Then explain in age-appropriate language that the law requires you to make a report and that the law is there to protect them. Then describe to the child in a way that they will understand who will be involved. And for example, telling them about a CPS caseworker who will come and investigate, and letting them know that they're going to be protected and not going to be in trouble for telling, but that other people are going to be made aware. Things definitely not to do when handling disclosure: don't disparage or criticize a child's choice of words or language. Don't suggest answers to the child or use leading questions. Don't probe or press for answers that the child is unwilling to give. Don't display shock or disapproval of the parents, the child, or the situation. Talk to the child with a group of interviewers, because that can be extremely intimidating. And definitely don't make promises to the child about not telling, and don't make promises to the child about how the situation will work out, because you just don't know. Lying, even unintentionally, to a child who has demonstrated trust in you is extremely harmful. If you don't know the answer to something, don't pretend that you do just to make them feel better in the moment, because if it doesn't turn out that way, that can be very damaging emotionally for them. So in summary, if you see something, say something. Very basic, right? And finally, 4 points that you need to really take away from this. The first being that you are mandated reporters and have a responsibility to the children under your care to abide by the New York State laws that were designed specifically to protect the children's welfare. The second, it is not your responsibility to investigate. It is only your responsibility to report your suspicions. If your suspicions turn out to be unfounded, you have done no harm by erring on the side of caution. But if a child tells you something, it's not your job to go talk to their parents and see if they're lying or not. Not your position. It's your position only to report your suspicions. Third point, Child Protective Services is not an enemy that's trying to take children away from their parents. Placing children in foster care is both expensive and labor-intensive, and it is highly preferable to provide in-home or outside supports and interventions to help resolve problems and ensure a child's well-being. They're not coming to take away kids the second they walk through the door. That's the last thing they want to do. If it's possible, they want to be able to help the family as a whole and keep a family intact. And so you have to weigh the consequences. The worst case scenario in making a call is being overly cautious. The worst case scenario in not calling could cost the life of a child. And so that's what it pretty much boils down to. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm grateful that my job is not your job. I wouldn't want to have to deal with this all week, but we do. We want to make it as easy for you. I want to underscore two things. One of the things Jenny talked about, kind of a gray area with reporters. It's possible that technically in a gray area you would not be a mandated reporter. Possible. However, we as a church are saying you're a mandated reporter. In other words, what that means is each of you are responsible. If you see something, say something. But we don't want you hanging out there with that, like, I have to remember all this, and what do I do? And it sounds really complicated. So what we are doing at this church is when you see something, to say something, you're going to communicate either to Beth Del Judas, she's going to be up here in a minute, or Steve Reese, you know Steve, one of our elders, or to me as the senior pastor, or whoever the next senior pastor is. And then that person will walk with you through paperwork and who you call. But if you just, if you just told Beth and she had to deal with it and fill out the paperwork, just hearing it, well, she wouldn't have all the information and facts squared away anyhow. But you then don't have to, Beth would make the call, Steve would make the call, but we want you to be a part of that process to make sure we're doing it right and accurately. Part of the reason, in fact, that we don't have, there's nothing you've heard or will hear tonight that we couldn't have had our junior helpers in, like some of the junior high kids that help with younger programs. They could have been a part of this, but I didn't want them a part of this because they are not mandated. They are minors. I want to put an exclamation point on the fact that if, bless you for working with our kids, by the way. The people last week, praise God. It's just, I was just thanking the Lord, sitting back there saying, look at all these people that serve kids in this church. Hallelujah. And the exclamation point is that we love you, we trust you. We've got a phenomenal team of youth workers and nursery workers and brigade and pioneer girls. And the exclamation point is, you're the adult, you're responsible, even if there's junior helpers. So be the adult, be alert, take responsibility for stuff we see. And by the grace of God, I hope we continue to get more and more people that are not saved yet, that are part of the community, entrusting their kids to us. It also means that we're opening the gate a lot wider for the possibility of kids that have been severely neglected, that are being hurt in some way. And we're in a position to be able to help with that. So you understand, and we're going to take some Q&A here in a little bit after Beth's piece. So if some of this wasn't clear, you can ask about it. So Beth, come on up. Oh, while she's coming up, one other thing. One of the things that could make this difficult is you see something and you're going, yeah, but she's my friend. Yeah, but we're Christians, and it can't be what I thought it was. I don't know. Or maybe you just go to the person and say, you know what I thought I saw? And then they kind of make it sound like it wasn't really what you saw, so you don't say anything. That's not acceptable. We would rather, as the last 2 points I think on the screen popped up, we're going to err on the side of caution. And if you make a mistake, if somebody says, Pastor Dave, I saw such and such, go to Beth or go to Steve and make sure it's cleared up. And if really nothing was going on, then we'll know. And we'll say, aren't we glad we erred on the side of caution than missing it? So we're not going to run around and look for demons behind every bush, okay? We don't want everybody walking on eggshells. But we want to have in the back of your head that we live in a sick world, terrible things happen, and we want to be ready for it. Now, some of you picked up these on the way in, the sheet that says, what is appropriate touch? If you didn't get one of these, put your hand up and I'll hand them out as we get started. So, Beth, come on up.
All right, I'll just start, and anything I'm going to say is going to be on the piece of paper. So the first topic is just what is appropriate touch. The things I'm going to be talking about are more specific to our church, whereas Jenny's piece was an overall, information about New York State and what's required. So what is appropriate touch with our kids? It's always with the same sex. If it's a male, two males together, a side hug is all that's needed. If it's, say, a male leader and a female student, a high five or a pat in the back is all that's needed. The reason for this is not only to make sure the child doesn't interpret the touch as anything it wasn't meant to be, but also that anyone observing from the outside could look at what you're doing and not have any questions. We just want to avoid the appearance of all evil. The truth is, our words are much more powerful indicators to kids than our touch. Okay, and then the other area is what is appropriate communication. Confidences. If a student needs to talk to a leader privately during an activity, it must be a leader of the same sex and they must be visible to others. So if you're a guy and a female student comes up to you and wants to talk to somebody, you need to like redirect them to a female that's in the room, just to keep any kind of one-on-one interaction between the same sexes. Jenny already kind of covered the second point, but don't make promises to keep secrets. And you need to let the student know that if they are being hurt or someone else is being hurt, or that the concern is so great, you're gonna have to break a confidence. This really is super important, and I know Jenny already covered it too, but I just want to underscore it because if you promise this and then you have to break it, you are now just another layer of betrayal in their life, and you don't want to be. It's better just up front to say, because usually a kid will start off not even telling you what they want to say. They'll just say, if I tell you something, will you promise not to tell anyone else? You can't say yes. You have to say, if I can, I won't. But, and give these rules to them so they know right up front, whatever they share, you may have to tell. And this third point is underscored, for now. There'll be no one-on-one mentoring with a student. This will be revisited once we have a youth pastor or director with sufficient time and training who could oversee this and supervise this. Any possible exceptions, you'd need to talk to, I guess, a senior pastor or an elder, and if you were one of those exceptions, then they would need to have parental written consent to do that. And again, this is really for us just to make sure we are being appropriate at all times and in all cases. And the reality is we may be doing it appropriately, but we need to have supervision over that. You know, like I work at Youth Mentoring, and that's a one-on-one mentoring program. But we do have written parental consent, and we're also being supervised by case managers like myself. So we do need to have somebody in place to allow certain things to go on. So, so that's just kind of quote-unquote on hold, all right? Calling, texting, emailing, any kind of communication with students. Again, for now, we really just want to use any kind of calling, texting, and emailing to communicate information about activities only. And again, any of that stuff should be same sex. You know, a male leader should not be texting female students or calling female students. Unless, of course, it's in a general group text. Like I know, for example, like Audra sends out group texts for all the kids' church leaders. That's fine, because it's public information. It's a group text. And again, the reason is just to have healthy boundaries with our students and to avoid any miscommunication and to avoid any misinterpretation of a communication. This also goes for social media. For now, the church is asking that youth group leaders not be on social media with students, and again, same with Pioneer Girls or Boys Brigade. I don't know if you guys would do that. It might be more of a youth group situation, but any youth leader should not be on social media with the kids. And again, this policy is open to being changed once we have a youth pastor or director who could oversee appropriate use of social media. Right now, we just don't have that person. So that's why it's we're gonna ask, and if you already are on social media, we're also gonna be telling the kids this rule and the new rule so that when you have to either unfriend them or do whatever you have to do, they'll understand it's not personal. You're not doing it because you want to do it, you're doing it to just be to submit to the church policy, and it's for their protection. Okay, so that's pretty self-explicit. And again, with different sexes, shouldn't be on it anyway. Just you leave yourself open to so much misinterpretation. And these rules, just so you know too, the policy that's going to be put in place is not only a protection for the kids, it's a protection for you. It's a protection for what you could be accused of doing when you might not have done anything at all. Okay? The other, I do want to make this point, though, in regard to social media. The other reason for this is that sometimes students communicate information over social media, and they assume you have read it or seen it, and that you will come to them and address it with them. We've had kids over at Youth Mentoring that have kind of communicated suicidal wishes and assume that their mentor is viewing it, but they may not have. So that's why I know at Youth Mentoring we don't allow mentors on social media with kids. And the same applies here. Also for you guys, because we are a church family, if you're on social media with students and then you start seeing some of the things they're doing or behaviors they're interacting in, kind of puts yourself in a conundrum. Do you tell their parent? Do you say something about it? And now you're kind of caught in the middle. So again, these are some of the reasons why this rule is in place for now. And again, specifically for the youth group, we're going to be sharing it with the students there so that they're aware of the rules, so that they won't feel offended that a youth group leader is personally, doesn't want to be friends with them on social media. The last piece is what is appropriate transportation of students, meaning transporting kids to and from church activities and events. And we did change this from last week. So if anybody heard what went on last week, this is a little different this week. We did lighten up some of the rules. Any driver should have written permission or a waiver from the parent. I think Pioneer Girls does it. I think whoever's in Pioneer Girls would know better, but where the parent puts down any person that they would allow to pick up their student. So it just needs written permission from a parent. There's never only one child in the vehicle with one adult, unless, of course, it's your own child. If the driver is the only adult in the vehicle, all the children must be of the same sex. So if I'm driving a vehicle by myself, kids in the vehicle must be the same sex as the driver. And again, this pertains to you as a youth leader. Me in my personal life, if I'm transporting my son and his friends, I'm allowed to do that. If I was a youth group leader, it would be different. And again, these things apply to short trips, things, local, about 30 minutes. If there's a long journey and you're going on a long trip and you're transporting multiple students, there needs to be 2 adults in the vehicle. And this is, again, not only to keep everything on the up and up, but someone else to be accountable for what's going on in the car. 2 adults need to be accountable. And last week it was said that married couples couldn't transport kids together, but they can. Married couples can transport children together. So this policy is going to be in place as of now, and we'll be getting everybody in the whole church copies of it, so everyone will know what the rules are. Good? Okay.
And Jenny, you want to come back up? So we'll take a few minutes and answer any questions. All of us or any one of us. Yes?
I just have a question about the driving. What if your role blends with your parent's role? If you're a Pioneer Girl...
Well, then your parent role versus your position role would already supersede that. In other words, if...
I was a leader in an event, but my friend said, can you take my kids to, whatever, PBS or whatever, and I am a worker there. Is that, how does that...
No, yes, a lot of us have, a lot of you have relationships already with other couples, other families in the church, and the kids are in and out of your house, they're in and out of your car, and you've been doing that. The defining line, and you just have to use discernment, and we're trusting you not to abuse it. The discernment is, do you have that relationship because you already have the personal relationship, or is the relationship precisely because of your role? If the relationship is just because you're a brigade leader, then it doesn't matter if you've been doing it a long, long time. That's the basis of the relationship. They're not kids that have been in and out of your house. So, yeah, you can bring them to an event, but it's because you've already have the personal relationship. Does that make sense? In other words, we're not telling you how to regulate your lives with who your friends are, but we, for a couple of reasons. One of them is just liability. The church at large is liable as well for your behavior. We're liable for that. And, but we're not liable for your personal behavior. Yeah, Nancy?
Okay, so I guess it's kind of similar, but like, in the summer, a lot of the kids go to camp together. So I might have like 3 or 4 boys, girls in my car. We meet here, we all go from here to camp, but it's not a youth event or a church event. That's okay, right? It's a personal thing.
Well, one of the
But that would be okay, because she's not
Yeah.
transporting them as a leader. She's
yeah,
as a
well,
parent.
you're not transporting them necessarily as a leader, but what if 2 of the boys are the kids that have been in and out of your house since they were 7? But 2 of the boys, the only reason they're in the car is because they're in the youth group. Then I'd say put those other 2 boys in another car or have 2 leaders. Because that's a great example, because that's exactly the defining line. One is you have a personal relationship. The other is the relationship is strictly because of the ministry you're involved with. And you know, we may lighten up some of these, you know, by the fall or something, but let's make sure we're doing it right and getting it right before we start loosening things up. Yes, Lisa, I think next.
I've got a couple questions. I need some clarification on the whole Facebook thing with youth group, because I do know that that's how they communicate, or have communicated events and things. So are you saying that anyone who works as a leader in is not allowed to have a student as a Facebook friend? I'm a little bit unclear on like.
You're talking about, like, I know, because
recorded.
Noah's in youth group, so, right, like Facebook, I know you guys use Facebook to communicate events. That's coming from the Facebook page of yeah, that's fine, because that's coming from like the youth group thing. I think what we're talking about is more personal friending, like you have just.
So you're saying that anyone who's a leader in youth group needs to go onto their Facebook page and unfriend any minor?
Well, just to clarify, I'm not saying that. This is the church policy. So I don't want this to be a personal attack, because it can feel like that. So the church policy is for now, yes, and we're going to tell the kids that as well. So if you want to wait till Friday, because that's when I'm going to come and tell them what the rules are.
Well,
Yeah, and then,
it was already made on Friday.
oh, okay.
And I do know, just from talking to my daughter and
Yeah.
a couple of them, they're very, very upset about that.
I get that.
Because of, you know, the pendulum, I understand.
Mhm.
I get it. You gotta swing the pendulum.
What we're really trying to tell them is this is for now, because we need to get things on track here at our church.
I
And
understand.
right.
I've got some kids that are seniors that would like to have that mentoring relationship with a female youth.
Well, I think what we said here is if there's possible exceptions, if you have one, then you should talk to Pastor Dave or the elders about it, and then they'll go from there on a case-by-case basis. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike?
How are you defining the age of an adult and a child? I'll give you an example. It goes all ways. Last summer, my daughter was one of 2 adults that went to Tuscarora with the kids, and she's barely an adult. And it put her in a tremendous position of responsibility that she wasn't ready for. And it was unfair to her and unfair to the kids in terms of protecting there. So how do we define adult? Is it 18? Is it 25? And how do we identify a child? Because everything's been silent on that. Is it under 18? Is it under whatever?
Well, the second part is the easier one. Yeah, 17 and under are a child. So the presentation tonight is nursery through 17-year-olds. Now, it doesn't mean we can't use junior leaders in ministry, but back to who's responsible for reporting, they're clearly not adults. The other part, it depends on the ministry. I mean, we can't say, well, some 18-year-olds are not really adults. Some there's some 35-year-olds that don't seem to be really adults. So that's going to have to be worked on within each ministry. And whether are we dealing with a youth program? Are we dealing, for instance, what you're referring to with your daughter? That should never have happened. Now, she should have been able to go, but there should have been other adult, older women that were a part of that. And those narrower, narrowing down those policies, that's going to happen within each ministry team as they decide what works for them and what are their standards for each of those groups. But in fact, we want each ministry to do that. So if we said, well, it's 21, well, what if the 21-year-old's got a maturity issue? Who decides that? Well, it should be the ministry group and the ministry leader that works with them to make those determinations. So, good observation, question. Yes, Amherst.
So my daughter has an established relationship with some same-sex youth leaders, and she's not always able to do it. So if she wants to communicate something that's going on with her that maybe she doesn't feel comfortable talking to her parents about, and she's not able to go to youth group, like how is she supposed to do that? Or is she supposed to, does she have to go to youth group to maybe, does she pull them aside? Like, I don't know, you know what I mean? I'm not really sure what to tell her because she wants to.
I think if she has that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong with the policy, if she has that, then that would be one of the exceptions that maybe you and her want to talk to Pastor Dave about. Because I think if there is exceptions to that, what it's going to be is that we're going to need parental consent to one-to-one mentoring. Because this is also, because for me personally, as a parent, not as, I don't want anybody meeting with my child one-on-one without me knowing about it. So that's going to be part of it. So I think if she has that, you could come with her to talk to Pastor Dave and with the youth leader that she's connected to.
I'm not as nice as Beth. So you can come and talk to me, but we're going to have some very upset kids because the pendulum has been way too loose. And what Beth mentioned earlier about, for now, the deal is, well, like what they do with youth mentoring. So if I was working with youth mentoring, or I'll just say our church, and we said, yes, I can communicate on social media, texting, whatever it is, and even if the parent signs off, I would be writing some kind of report. When did I call? What was the content of the call? How long did it last? Every call. 6 times a week. Every call, 6 times. Then who would check that? We have nobody to check that. So since we do not have someone in the kind of position to be the one actually it's part of Beth's job, where Long Island Youth Mentoring is working with mentors. We do not have the scope and the means to do that. And when we have that, it'd be much easier because now we've got a built-in check and balance system. But since we don't have that, we're going to be much more strict than what we've been in the past. And in fact, next Friday night when Beth's there, we think and we're praying that we'll be able to communicate to the kids why we're doing this. And then what will also happen is, particularly with our youth group, so we're talking about the junior and senior high kids, for that group in particular, we're going to come up with some other creative means. In other words, if they hopefully do still trust their leaders, they want to dialogue with their leaders, may want to share things with them, and if it's something that needs to come out on a Monday and can't wait till a Friday, well, we'll see how urgent it is. I mean, and try to come up with some creative ways to work on that. But we're going to have to, we don't have all the answers to that. We're working on it. It's a work in progress. But I'm telling you that for right now, it's going to be pretty strict. We've got to reel it in. It was utterly out of control. And that was not the fault or even a hint of a problem with any of our youth leaders. We have an exceptional group of adult leaders. I mean, really exceptional. Their love, their compassion, their trust. We unfortunately only had one person that was severely way off the charts violating it. But because it was way off the charts and we've had no written policies, we're reining it in. And the short term, it's not going to be easy to do, but it's absolutely right and it's absolutely necessary. Good.
Could one of the youth, kids in youth group, like a young lady, have a conversation with 2 female youth leaders? Or does it have to be more than 1 kid and more than 1 leader?
Well, see, that's one of the things that opens it up. Now there's 2 leaders. So both leaders know what the other one said. They were there. Yeah, so that's not a problem with the policy.
Like
It-
if you're in a setting of youth group, say you're all wherever you are, downstairs or whatever, and a young lady approaches you and talks to you, if you're talking to her in the one-on-one in the youth group room, you can do that. Yeah.
If Grace wanted to talk, or whatever, young lady wanted to talk to her best youth leader, her favorite youth leader, and that you can just like, that would be great, I'd love to talk to you, Grace, but I'm gonna bring Nancy or Vanessa, or,
Sure.
is that
Yeah.
okay?
Yes.
Yeah. No, there's two people. One of the things we'll do, if the questions are for a specific group, whether it's the youth leaders, brigade, Pioneer Girls, those that can stay after we're done, we'll break into groups. The questions right now really need to be not, what do I do about this kid in this place? Otherwise, we'll be standing up here answering questions for a long time that won't apply to many of us. Somebody else. Karen, did you have your hand up?
I think we can. I think we can.
Yeah, we can. The question had to do with transportation and signing waivers are released to be able to drive, and can we come up with a standardized document?
I mean, someone told me, I don't know, is anyone from Pioneer Girls here? No, like, they're on the form, you just, like, maybe you could just give me a copy of that form? Because maybe we could just make that and whoever ministry leaders are when the students, over the next few weeks, as the students are getting dropped off by parents, have the parents sign it and write the names of anyone they are okay with driving their kid.
Yeah.
I have one other thing. I think it's important to mention the concept of confidentiality, so that if we were in a position to suspect something or there was something that we thought we needed to report, it's only reported to the person that was supposed to report it to, and not make it a topic of conversation.
Right.
Whose business it's not.
Right, if some child either discloses abuse to you, or you notice it, or you're concerned, the only people you should tell would be me or Steve or the senior pastor, because that's the person then who will decide with you and walk you through the process. You don't want to be telling all the workers in the ministry, unless they also have noticed things too, but no, you want to.
Well, in fact, if
to
you
the right
started
person.
telling other people, you'd end up in precisely what Jenny was talking about with the whole Penn State thing. Inadvertently, you'd be maybe doing it innocently, but you told this person, and then now that person hears it, and now does that person think, well, am I responsible? Who do I tell? And then maybe since you told these three people, then you kind of out of sight, out of mind, you forget, oh, I had to call Beth. So
Yeah,
we
it's
want
just also,
to make it easier.
You also wouldn't be protected under the law anymore. As a mandated reporter, if you're just telling other people, aside from your supervisor or the state directly, those people could tell whoever you're talking about, and then those people could sue you. You're no longer protected under the law as a mandated reporter if somebody else that you told tells the subject that you were making a report about them or suspicious of them. The law wouldn't cover that.
Yeah, so that, thanks for that point. In other words, you tell the right person, and then you not only can you not get in trouble, you're protected, and it doesn't go anywhere else. There's no liability that comes back to you for making the report.
and also just as a fellow human being, not to uncover people publicly, you know what I mean? I think it would just be just as a human being, you shouldn't share those things with other people.
Let's just do one more. I want to have enough time for any of the groups that want to get together, because I'm trying to watch the clock for everybody. Yes.
Supposing a young man or young lady wanted to speak with a specific leader who they were very comfortable with, how would that be arranged? Would you bring in a second person and the young person might not want to talk? What would you do in a situation like that?
It probably would depend on the ministry area. I mean, if there was no other avenue, in other words, if they wanted, somebody said they wanted to talk to you, why would they want to talk to you, or why do they want to talk to me? Probably because there's some nature of a relationship, and if there isn't already already a healthy relationship, then a wise thing would do, in fact, I do this now, so the elders, we don't always do it this way, but it depends on who we're talking to. I'm talking about adults, not even minors. Sometimes we'll say, do you mind if one of the other elders sit in? I've done that this year, over the last year and a half. Or one of the elders will say, do you mind? And I've never had anybody say no. Because if they really want help and they really know you care, why wouldn't you want to bring another set of ears and eyes to make sure you hear the same thing? Yeah, so that's probably the route we'd go. All right, I just said one, but I'll take one more if that was a good generic kind of question. It's got to be generic. Yes. I took it partly because it was my wife, too.
I'm just gonna throw one you mentioned. So this is the list that she had up on the screen of mandated reporters.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see youth workers, I don't see this group being.
Well, unfortunately, two things. Unfortunately, for one, and I do believe unfortunately, religious workers in general, I don't know why they're not on these lists. In fact, I looked at that. There's nothing for pastors or senior pastors. But I feel like I'm equal to some of those places. And in fact, I just told Jenny this week. I'm going to go online and do all the paperwork to get certified that I did it, because I think I'm responsible. And what was it that you said we're likened to? Tell them that again.
To fit it on the slide, I took out some of the longer legal prefixes and suffixes, but in pretty much every area it starts by this, including but not limited to, and they keep updating it because they had just general summer camps and they had to define every type of summer camp that there is. So they try and make the prefixes and suffixes very general to imply any organization working with children. And the ones that I highlighted are the ones that we typically fall under, because instead of listing every specific religious organization, it just falls under their school-age children who are being provided care in a group by a non-parent. And so that kind of encompasses this area as well as pretty much every other church or non-church organization. You don't have to be specifically named to be on there.
Yes.
Thank you.
You don't have to be my wife to get special treatment. You can be anybody else.
For Sunday school, is there a policy now, or has there been a policy for there to always be 2 adults in each classroom?
We have not, no, there has not been a policy. And some of that, by the way, what we're going to be doing probably with, right now because we've shifted to a kids' church program, so you have multiple leaders. So you're talking about like the 4- and 5-year-old class? Sure. And so they're going to end up falling in, plus you got glass in the doors and there's people here. We're going to end up with a junior helper. In other words, but the adults still have somebody. But no, there hasn't been a policy, which is partly why we're doing this. We'll have policies. Sure. So, and again, that's a category where we're tweaking those kind of things to make sure that basically nobody's alone with kids. Yeah. If you can stay a little bit more for any groups that do want to meet together, anybody with the nursery, thanks Debbie for coming back out. Debbie was here last week. She's already in the back, so any nursery workers can go with Debbie in the back. Anybody else, if you want to pair up with your group, your leadership team, feel free to do that. Oh, and one other thing let me throw out. Dave reminded me, if you have not gone online and filled out the New York State form for background checks, get it done before you have a meeting this week, or don't come to the meeting this week. Tell your ministry leader you didn't get it done because you can't work with kids. Well, no, we said February. When's February 1st? Wednesday? All right, you might squeak in. We said February 1st, so if it's not done by February 1st, tell your ministry leader that you'll get it done, and when you get it done, you can come back to work. But until you get it done, don't show up. If you have a question about it, actually, Betty's here. She might be able to answer your question tonight. You can snag her real fast. Betty's in the back. Otherwise, you can call the office tomorrow, and she can give you the information on the background checks. Lisa, the really last one.
Really quick question. I know you touched on this before with the junior, you said something about junior high. Are you going to be doing some kind of training? I know that teenagers are not mandated reporters, but are you going to?
Yeah, actually, some of that will happen within the groups. In other words, we won't, well, actually, Beth's going to help out with one of the groups. But again, we're going to tweak that for each group. We wouldn't need to go through all of this, for instance, with most of the groups.
You know, Audra is having any of the kid church junior leaders just stay a little bit after youth group on Friday night, and I'm just going to be going over a very simple way for the kids using an acronym, which is BAT, believe, affirm, tell, for the juniors. So if the kids see something or something said to them, they believe, they affirm, and they tell, and that's so they will have some basic things to do.
Talking about like appropriate or inappropriate touch, those types of things. Are they going to be informed of that? What's appropriate for that?
Yeah, yeah. And I guess if you wanted to come and just listen to that piece, I know Audra's going to be doing something specific to Kids Church, but my piece is going to be just general, like kind of stuff that we talked here. So if any of the junior leaders want to just stay after youth group for like 10 minutes, 15 minutes with me and just listen in on that, that's fine.
Oh, I do have one more thing. Almost forgot. These forms I'm going to take in the back, and you signed in on the way out, or you signed in on the way in. Sign this on the way out. This is basically a simple statement that says you were here tonight, but it also says I'm making a commitment to be this kind of a person, to be responsible, trustworthy, an example to the kids we work with, and we need to have you sign and date this. So thank you very much for coming out. This will be on that table right in the back. Thanks.